firstly, this isn't Frankenstein. It's Frankenstein's monster, the monster created by Dr. Frankenstein. Basically, I've got this slide up behind me just to check that I'm on course. If his eyes come to light, give me warning, will you? Okay, so I'm talking to you today about Frankenstein on the couch, Dr. Frankenstein, how literary critics help us explore our dreams, secrets, and fears. And before I begin, I've got a little warm-up exercise for you. I want you just to spend a moment now, you can close your eyes, look down on the floor, whatever, and just try to think of what your greatest achievement so far has been. What has been your greatest achievement? Out of all the things you've done, what has been your most significant accomplishment? Okay. Second part of this exercise is to think about why you did it. Why did you do this thing, do you think? Just keep it in your mind. I'm not going to ask anyone to share, so I'm going to come back to this exercise a little bit later. Okay. So I'm here to talk to you today a little about English studies and the kind that you will study on the University of London International Programme, should you decide it's for you. Now, people often think that studying English is about reading books. And of course, to a large extent, it is. The study of English literature is about the study of books of all kinds, novels, short stories, printed plays, books of poetry, and so on and so forth. The study of English language, which forms about a quarter of our programme, should you wish to opt for it, is partly about the study of language used in written contexts, literature, print media, and so on. And not to forget that a large part of university-level study is about secondary reading, that is, books about the primary reading, the novels, the poetry, the printed plays, and so on. That is, reading works of criticism that critique the works that you study, that show them in a new and sometimes controversial light. This view of English as being about reading books is a pervasive one. I remember when I got my first teaching job, my parents asked me if I was running a book club. I wish. But modern English studies is so much more than being about reading books. In recent decades, it's matured into a humanities subject. Developments in relational subjects such as psychology, philosophy, sociology, politics, anthropology, and so on have fed into our understanding of what literary texts do for us as human beings and enabled us to discover within literary texts special knowledge about what it means to be human. That is, it's arguable that literary texts in their charting of human character, human actions, human emotions, and so on, however fictional, reflect back at us what makes us who we are, what makes us tick, what might be the meaning of human existence. Indeed, Freud, in his efforts to understand the human mind, famously turned to literary texts for answers, treating works like Hamlet and Oedipus Rex as case studies which investigate how early childhood experiences may impact on our adult decisions. Similarly, feminist activists have turned to literary texts to tease out hidden messages about society's prescribed roles for men and women. And those 20th century class warriors, the so-called Marxist critics, have performed similar excavations, mining literary texts for what they and the society they were produced in say about class division. In these latter two cases, feminists and Marxist critics have used literary texts as a means of revealing to us the implicit prejudices and inequalities endemic to human societies. Now, a text that has been much plundered in this way is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. To return to the thought exercise that you did at the beginning, what would you say was Dr. Frankenstein's greatest achievement? The creation of the monster, most would say, his creation of new life. This fellow here, or one version of him. So I want to turn now to a moment from the novel, unbiased by anybody else's opinion at this point, and I've popped this onto a handout. There should be enough to go round. I think it's on a yellow sheet. Can you all turn to that, or see one, or have sight of one? Don't worry, I'm going to read it out. I just want to focus a few moments on this. So here is Dr. Frankenstein's greatest achievement. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch with whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavoured to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful? Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost of the same colour as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shrivelled complexion and straight black lips. Now, one interpretation of this scene, and the words and arrangement of the words that Shelley has chosen to depict it, is what we might call a kind of bog-standard liberal humanist interpretation. So we take the writing for what it appears to be, the product of Shelley's artistry, and we read it thus. Dr. Frankenstein has worked very hard. He has toiled, the passage tells us, in terrible conditions. It's now 1 a.m. at night. The rain is pattering. It's a dreary night in November, to create something so spectacular, a new life, but which has, despite his best intentions, gone horribly wrong. His intended beautiful being instead a monstrous wretch. This interpretation is one that places us in sympathy with this fictional character, no one else. After all, we're all familiar with the experience of meaning well, only for our good intentions to result in an outcome we had not envisaged. So we can identify with that emotion. And this kind of human story often turns up in plot lines for romantic comedies and soap operas. But modern critics put other interpretations on the table for us. Psychoanalytical critics, for instance, those critics that take their inspiration from Freud's theories, would say that this passage tells us more about the character and mechanics of Dr. Frankenstein's mind than it does about his work. We're all familiar with Freud's conception of the mind as in 3 parts. We have the ego, which is our conscious, present mind. We have the superego, that part of our mind which serves as a moral conscience. And we have the id, the id, which is the unconscious part of our mind where we repress our base drives to do with sex, hunger and violence, where we consign unwanted or unpleasant memories, things we cannot bear to deal with in everyday life. The id, according to Freud, is that part of us which is wild yet dormant. It creeps out of us through jokes, puns, nightmares, dreams, psychological disorders. Psychoanalytical critics then would reread this passage and say that the monster is the embodiment of Dr. Frankenstein's id, his unconscious. His retreat into his work is not really about hard work or the project. It's a symbol for his retreat into his mind, brought about by cutting himself off from his family and working solo. The fact that it's nighttime when the monster comes to life parallels the darkness of the unconscious, its mystery and ultimate unknowability. And the monster himself exhibits hideous, wild qualities of the kind associated with base behaviour. His physical ugliness here is correspondent to the ugly emotions that the Doctor represses. So later on in the novel, we have the monster acting out various base behaviours. He murders, he steals, he deceives, and so on. So to these psychoanalytical critics, Frankenstein is the story of a man who has gone mad, and his unconscious has come to rule over him in the form of the monster. Some feminist critics have posited that Frankenstein created the monster because he could not live with the fact that women held some power in the world, that is, the power to give birth. In creating the monster, he is living out a domination fantasy that underpins patriarchal culture. He wants to create a male super race. Note here how the monster is male. When the monster asks, or rather threatens, Frankenstein for a mate, he toils and toils, and in the end, he's unable to create a female monster. He violently throws her parts and the instruments he used to create her into this dark sea at night. Here, a hybrid feminist psychoanalytical critic would say that he's literally thrown the concept of womanhood into the dark sea of the unconsciousness. He cannot cope with female presence. Feminist critics might argue then that this storyline, the rejection of women, is an allegory for Mary Shelley's own experience as one of the first female novelists struggling to be taken seriously. She was famously married to the romantic poet Percy Shelley, and here we have the story of a woman or women being sidelined in some way. So if you go to the wider story, you have female figures who are variously fragile, sickly, locked away, or placed in exile. Feminist critics say that these predicaments reflect gender inequalities in the wider culture, but they also read this scene with further sympathy for Mary Shelley, saying that it is allegorical of her own traumatic experiences of maternity. Shelley herself lost a child 5 days into its life, and her own mother died giving birth to her, and these experiences really got to her. And so feminist critics have made a lot of this and said that the monster presents an embodiment of this trauma, and we see this in the very visceral description of the way in which the lifeless thing in the text results in a catastrophe a few lines later. Marxist critics say something a little different. They might say that Frankenstein created the monster in an effort to assert his own class, and that the monster is a victim of the class divide. Frankenstein's of upper class stock. He goes off to a fancy university, and to gain this autonomy, he feels he has to create a visible and hideous underclass to rule over. And once this underclass is created, in the form of the monster, Frankenstein inflicts disadvantage on it. So we see him in this scene go on to desert the monster. He leaves him to fend for himself. The monster goes off and finds a hovel to live in. He tries to better himself through books, listening to locals talking to develop his language skills and so on. But despite all these efforts, the story tells us that the monster cannot truly escape his place in such a divided society. And this is played out in the fact that despite his self-education, he cannot shape up to a more civilized world. He cannot ultimately control his emotions, and he remains to the end a savage, given to wanton acts of violence and aggression. So maybe think a moment now which interpretation you particularly find credible. We could talk about this after the lecture. Perhaps you find merit in more than one. What would these critics say about your greatest achievement that you thought of earlier on? How might they decipher or place a hidden meaning on that? So, just to conclude, it's important to realise that each of these interpretations have their roots not just in the story, but in the language too. Literary works are of interest to scholars of other humanities disciplines, not just for what they seem to say about the human condition, but how they communicate these meanings. We're all familiar with the saying, it's not what you say, but how you say it that matters. Literary texts offer us a special example of language use that has the power to convey a multitude of meanings. They're hugely symbolic to the extent they give us great pleasure to read and cause us great pain to write ourselves. This kind of intense work with language is what you would do if you chose to study our programme. Through doing so, you would be gaining knowledge of other humanities fields, whether you choose to study English in the singular or in combination with another subject. And perhaps this is why English is one of our largest and most popular humanities subjects offered through the international programmes, and why English studies itself continues to figure in the top 10 subject lists for university subjects studied throughout the world. So if you want to talk to me further about any element of the programme, or what else the monster might represent for Dr. Frankenstein, I'd be very happy to chat with you after the talks are finished. Thank you very much for listening.